Good day, everyone. I am Mansrato B. Sungay III, and I'm going to report about the evolution of the Philippine taxation. So, in today's world, taxation is a reality that all citizens must contend with for the primary reason that the governments raise revenue from the people they govern to be able to function fully. In exchange for the taxes the people pay, the government promises to improve the citizens' lives through good governance. Taxation, as a government mechanism to raise funds, developed and evolved through time. And in the context of the Philippines, we must understand that if it came with our colonial experience. The taxation in Spanish Philippines. The Philippines may have abundant natural resources even before the encroachment of the Spaniards, but our ancestors were mainly involved in a subsistence economy, and while the payment of tribute or taxes, buwis or handog, or the obligation to provide labor services to the datos in some early Filipino communities in the Philippines may resemble taxation. It is essentially different from the contemporary meaning of the concept. The arrival of the Spaniards altered this subsistence system because they imposed the payment of tributes from the Filipinos, similar to what had been practiced in all colonies in America. The purpose is to generate resources to finance the maintenance of the islands, such as salaries of government officials and expenses of the clergy. The difficulty faced by the Spaniards in revenue collection through the tribute was the dispersed nature of the settlements, which they solved by introducing the system of reduction by creating pueblos, where Filipinos were gathered and awarded plots of land to till. Later on, the settlements will be handled by encomenderos who received rewards from the Spanish crown for their services. Exempted from payment of tributos were the principals, alcaldes, gobernadores, cabezas de barangay, soldiers, members of the civil guard, government officials, and vagrants. The Filipinos who were once satisfied with agricultural production for subsistence had to increase production to meet the demands of payments, and a more intensive agricultural system had to be introduced. Later on, half of the tribute was paid in cash, and the rest with the produce. This financed the conquest of the Philippines. Toward the end of the 16th century, the Manila Acapulco trade was established through the galleons, a way by which the Spaniards could make sure that European presence would be sustained. Once a year, the galleon would be loaded up with merchandise from Asia and sent to New Spain, Mexico, and back. This improved the economy of the Philippines and reinforced the control of the Spaniards all over the country. Tax collection was still very poor, and subsidy from the Spain would be needed through the situado real delivered from the Mexican treasury to the Philippines through. This subsidy stopped as Mexico became independent in 1820. In 1884, the payment of tribute was put to a stop and was replaced by a poll tax collected through a certificate of identification called a cedula personal. This is required from every resident and must be carried while traveling. Unlike the tribute, the payment of cedulas is by person, not by family. Payment of the cedula is progressive and according to income categories. This system, however, was a heavy burden for the peasants and was easy for the wealthy. But because of this, revenue collection greatly increased and became the main source of government income. The Chinese in the Philippines were also made to pay their discriminatory cedula, which was bigger than what the Filipinos paid. Two direct taxes were added in 1878 and imposed on urban incomes. Urbana is a tax on the annual rental value of an urban real estate. Industria is a tax on salaries, dividends, and profits. These taxes were universal and affected all kinds of economic activity, except agriculture, which was exempt to encourage growth. Indirect taxes such as custom duties were imposed on exports and imports to further raise revenue, especially during the 19th century when economic growth increased exponentially. There were no excise taxes collected by the Spaniards throughout the years of colonialism. The colonial government also gained income from monopolies, such as the sale of the stamp paper, manufacture and sale of liquor, cockpits, and opium. But the biggest of the state monopolies was tobacco, which began in 1781 and halted in 1882. Only certain areas were assigned to cultivate tobacco, which the government purchased at a price dictated to the growers. This monopoly made it possible for the colony to create a surplus of income that made it self-sufficient without the need for the studio reel, and even contributed to the treasury of Spain. Forced labor was a character of Spanish colonial taxation in the Philippines and was required from the Filipinos. It proved useful in defending the territory of the colony and augmenting the labor required by woodcutting and shipbuilding, especially during the time of the galleon trade. Through the polo system, male Filipinos were obliged to serve a burden that resulted in an increase in death rate and flight to the mountains, which led to a decrease in population in the 17th century. This changed later on as polos and servicios became lighter and was organized at the municipal level. Labor provided was used in public works such as the building of roads and bridges. Some were made to serve the municipal office or as night guards. Males were required to provide labor for 40 days a year, reduced to 15 days a year in 1884. They may opt out by paying the fellas of 3 pesos per annum, which was usually lost to corruption because it was collected at the municipal level and were known acaidasor droppings. The polos would called Prestician personal service says by the second half of the 19th century. Taxation in the Philippines during the Spanish colonial period was characterized by the heavy burden placed on the Filipinos and the corruption of the principals, or the former datos and local elites who were co-opted by the Spaniards to subjugate and control the natives on their behalf. The principals who were given the positions such as cabezas rather, the barangay or alcalde in the local government, were able to enrich themselves by pocketing tributos and or fellas, while the peasants were left to be abused. Taxation appeared progressive, but the disparity between the less taxed principals and the heavily taxed peasants made the rich richer and the poor poorer. The tax. With regard to your question on this, the answer is very long, as it is the cause of traveling misery here. What I can write, you will be the only one half of the story, and even Dumas Senior cannot exhaust the subject. Nevertheless, I try to write I can. Half of it here. There are many kids with taxes, what they call irrigated rice land, and if it has no water, must pay a tax of 50 kavanes of palay and husk rice. And the land with 6 kavanes of seed may pay 5 pesos in cash. The land they call dry land, what that is planted to sugar cane, maize, and others, pay different rates, even if the agreed amount is 30 pesos for land with 6 canvases of seed. If they see the harvest is good, they increase the tax, but if they don't, decrease it if the harvest is poor. There is land whose tax is 2 pesos or 20 pesos, according to custom. The most troublesome are the residential lots in the town. There is no fixed rule that is followed, only their whim. Hence, even if it is only one span in size, if a stone wall is added, 50 pesos must be paid, the lowest being 20 pesos, but a nipa or Kogan house pays only 1 peso for an area of 10 fathoms square. Another feature of this system is that on the day you accept conditions, the contract will be written which cannot be changed for 4 years. But the tax is increased every year. For these reasons, for 2 years now, the payment of tax is confused, and little by little the fear of residents hereof, the word vacant, is being dispelled, which our ancestors had feared so much. The result is bargaining, like they do in buying fish. It is advisable to offer a low figure, and payment can be postponed, unlike before when people were very much afraid to pay after May. I'm looking for a receipt to send you, but I cannot find any because we don't set a receipt every time we pay. Anyway, it is valueless as it does not state the amount paid, it only says the tax for that year was paid without stating whether it is 5 centavos, 20 centavos, 100 centavos, 100 pesos. The residents who ask or get the said receipt accept it with closed eyes. The receipt has no signature in the place where the amount paid ought to be. Although it bears their name, until now I cannot comprehend why some are signed and others are not. This is more or less what is happening here in the payment of the land tax. Has been so far for many years since I can remember. Besides this, the tax on the plants the fields that are far from the town, like the land in Pansol, are various. The tax on the pala is separate from the tax in maize, mango, or garlic. There is no limit to this tax, only for they fix it themselves. Since July no one buys sugar, and since June locusts are all over the town, and they are destroying palay and sugar cane, which is what we regret here. The governor gave 50 pesos to pay the catchers of locusts. When it took them to town hall, they were paid only 2 cents, a cavan and a half. Seems to be locusts are not decreasing. According to the guests of the residents here, only 300 cavanes of locusts have been caught in this town. Many still remain, though the governor has not sent any more money. The people have not stopped catching them. Taxation under Americans. The Americans who acquired the Philippines aim to make the economy self-sufficient by running the government with the smallest possible sum of revenue, and create a surplus in the budget from 1898 to 1903. The Americans followed the Spanish system of taxation with some modifications, nothing that the system introduced by the Spaniards were outdated and regressive. The military government suspended the contracts of the sale of opium, lottery, and mint charges for coinage of money. Later on, the oil ban would be replaced by tax on real estate, which became known as land tax. The land tax was levied on both urban and rural real estate. The problem with land tax was that land titling in the rural area was very disorderly. The appraising of land value was influenced by political and familiar factors, and the introduction of a taxation system on agricultural land faced objections from the landed elite. Tax evasion was prevalent, especially among the elites. The International Revenue Law of 1904 was passed as a reaction to the problems of collecting land tax. It prescribed 10 major sources of revenue. 509 meters taxes on firm dealing in alcohol beverage and tobacco, excess taxes on alcoholic beverages and tobacco products, taxes on banks and bankers, document stamp taxes, cedula, taxes on insurance and insurance companies, taxes on forest products, mining concessions, taxes on business and manufacturing, and occupational licenses. The cedula went through changes in the new law as the rate was fixed per adult male, which resulted in a great decline in revenues. In 1907, some provinces were authorized to double the fee for the cedula to support the construction and maintenance of roads. The industrial tax was levied on the business community and became a highly complex system. To assign a certain tax to an industrial or commercial activity according to their profitability. The new act also imposed a percentage tax on sales payable quarterly. In 1913, the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act was passed, resulting in a reduction in the revenue of the government as export taxes levied on sugar, tobacco, hemp, and copper were lifted. To make up for the loss, then Governor General Francis Borton Harris urged that tax receipts be increased to make up for the loss. Minor changes were made to the 1904 Internal Revenue Act, such as the imposition of taxes on mines, petroleum products, and dealers of petroleum products and tobacco. New sources of taxes were introduced later on. In 1914, an income tax was introduced. In 1919, an inheritance tax was created. And in 1932, a national lottery was established to create more revenue for the government. However, these new creations were not enough to increase government revenues. Taxation during the Commonwealth period. New measures and legislation were introduced to make the taxation system appear more equitable during the Commonwealth. Income tax rates were increased in 1936, adding a surface rate on individual net incomes in excess of 10,000 pesos. Income tax rates of corporations were also increased. In 1937, the cedula tax was abolished, which appeared to be a progressive move. But in 1940, a residence tax was imposed on every citizen aged 18 years old and on every corporation. In 1939, the Commonwealth government drafted the National Internal Revenue Code, introducing major changes in the new tax systems as follows. The normal tax of 3% and the surtax on income was replaced by a single tax at a progressive rate. Personal exemptions were reduced. Corporation income tax was slightly increased by introducing taxes on inherited estates or gifts donated in the name of dead persons. The cumulative sales tax was replaced by a single turnover tax of 10% on luxuries. Taxes on liquors, cigarettes, forestry products, and mining were increased. Dividends were made taxable. The introduced tax structure was an improvement of the earlier system introduced by the Americans, but still remained inequitable. The lower class still felt the bulk of the burden of taxation, while upper class, the landed elite, or the people in political positions were able to maneuver a situation that would benefit them more. The agriculture sector was still taxed low to promote growth, but there was no incentive for industrial investment to take root and develop. Finally, a common character of taxation during the American occupation in the Philippines was not used to diversity, the economy, or direct economic development, as some sectors still carried this disproportionate share of the tax burden. As World War II reached the Philippine shores, economic activity was put to a stop and the Philippines bowed to a new set of administrators. The Japanese military administration in the Philippines during World War II immediately continued the system of tax collection, introduced during the Commonwealth but exempted the articles belonging to the Japanese armed forces. Foreign trade fell, and the main sources of taxation came from the amusements, manufacturers, professions, and business licenses. As the war raged, tax collection was a difficult task, and additional income for the government were derived from the sales of the national sweepstakes and sale of government bonds. The expenditure of the Japanese military government grew greatly, and they issued military notes in order to cover the cost of the war. Fiscal policy from 1946 to present. The impact of the war on the Philippine economy was effectively disparate, as Manila, the capital, was razed to the ground, while the rest of the Philippines was relatively untouched, but the highly agriculture-based economy was disrupted. The United States may have declared the Philippines independent, but as the country needed rehabilitation funds from the United States, the dependency of the Philippines to the Americans was an opportunity to be taken advantage of the former colonial administrators. The economic situation was so problematic that by 1949 there were a severe lack of funds in every aspect of governance, such as the military and education sectors. No efforts were made in improved tax collection, and the United States advised the adoption of direct taxation. The administration of President Manuel Rojas declined the proposal because it did not want to alienate its allies in Congress. The impetus for economic growth came during the time of President Elpidio Quirino through the implementation of import and exchange controls that led to import substitution development. This policy allowed for the expansion of a viable manufacturing sector that reduced economic dependence on imports. New tax measures were also passed, which included higher corporate tax rates that increased government revenue. Tax revenue in 1953 increased twofold compared to 1948, the year when Quirino first assumed presidency, while the succeeding presidencies of Magsaysay, Garcia, and Macapagal promised to study the tax structure and policy of the country. Through the creation of a tax commission in 1959 by means of Republic Act No. 2211 to make way for a more robust and efficient tax collection scheme. Post-war fiscal policy remained regressive, characterized by the overburdening of the lowest classes, while the landed elite who held business interests were in Congress to ensure that taxes would not be levied to them who belonged to the higher classes of society. The period of the post-war republic also saw a rise in corruption from 1958 to 1968, or rather 59 to 68. Congress did not pass any tax legislation despite important changes in the economy, and the vested interests of Filipino businessmen in Congress would manifest in mainly instances such as the rejection of taxes on imports. Indirect taxation still contributed to 3/4 of tax revenue. The Omnibus Tax Law of 1969 did not increase the ratio of income tax to general tax revenue. Collection of taxes remained poor, tax structure was still problematic, and much of public funds were 1031 to corruption, which left the government incapable of funding projects geared toward development. Under the Marcos authoritarian regime, the tax system remained regressive. During the latter part of the Marcos years, 1981 to 85, the tax system was still heavily dependent on indirect taxes, which made up 7% tax collection. Tax system also remained unresponsive. Taxes grew at an average annual rate of 15% and generated a low tax yield tax effort defined as the ratio between the share of the actual tax collection in gross domestic products and predictable taxable capacity was at a low 10.7%. As Corazon Aquino took the helm of government after the EDSA revolution, she reformed the tax system through the 1968 Tax Reform Program. The aim was to improve the responsiveness of tax system, promote equity by ensuring that similarly situated individuals and firms bear the same tax burden, promote growth by withdrawing or modifying taxes that reduce incentives to work or produce, and improve tax administration by simplifying the tax system and promoting tax compliance. A major reform in the tax system introduced under the term of Aquino was the introduction of the value-added tax, or VAT, with the following features: uniform rate of 10% on sale domestic and imported goods and services, and 0% on exports and foreign currency denominated sales. 10% in lieu of varied rates applicable to fixed taxes, 60 nominal rates. Advanced sales tax, tax on original sales, subsequent sales tax, compensing tax, metal tax, contractors tax, brokers tax, lessons, ridiculous tax, excess tax on solvents and mismatches, and excess tax on processed vegetables. 2% tax 2% tax on titles with annual sales or receipts of less than 5,200,000. Adoption of tax credit method of calculating tax by subtracting tax on inputs from tax on gross sales. Exemption of the sale of basic commodities such as agriculture and marine food products in their original state, price-regulated petroleum products and fertilizers. Additional 20% tax on non-essential articles such as jewelry, perfume, toilet waters, yacht, and other vessels for pleasure and sports. The VAT law was signed in 1986 and put to effect in 1988. While it was a reliable source of revenue for the government, new tax laws would reduce its reliability as legislated exemptions grew. Along with tax reform came the administrative reforms such as the restructuring of the Department of Finance and its attached agency, the Bureau of Internal Revenue (BIR), through the Executive Order 127. Tax collection and tax audits were intensified. Computerization was introduced and corruption was relatively reduced, which improved the trust in BIR in general. As a result of the tax reform of the Aquino administration, both tax and revenue effort rose, increasing from 10.7% in 1985 to 15.4% in 1992. Greater political stability during the administration of Fidel Ramos in 1992 were allowed for continued economic growth. The Ramos administration ventured into its own tax reform program in 1997 through the Comprehensive Tax Reform Program, which was implemented to make the tax system board-based, simple, and reasonable tax rates, minimize tax avoidance allowed by existing laws and loopholes in the system, encourage payments by increasing tax exemption levels, lowering the high tax rates, simplifying produce, and rationalize the grant of tax incentives, which was estimated to be worth 531.7 billion pesos in 1994. The VAT base was also voted in 1997 in goods services through Republic Act 7716. VAT law were as follows. So these are it. So yeah. The succeeding term of President Joseph Estrada in 1998 was too short to constitute any changes in the tax system. Then Vice President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo was swept to power through another EDSA revolution. As president, she undertook increased government spending without adjusting tax collection. This resulted in large deficits from 2002 to 2004. The government had to look for additional sources of revenue. And in 2005, the Expanded Value Added Tax (EVAT) was signed into law as Republic Act 9337. And that's all about the evolution of tax in the Philippines. Thank you.